Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Traffic Safety Academy. We are in, you guys are in listen-only mode. Just letting everyone know that it's here at the moment, that we've gone live to let you guys know that you're in the right place. We're doing our final preparation, and the webinar will begin shortly after 10. So, Frank, did you want us to promote you to a organizer so that you can keep track of the questions as they come?
Okay.
I actually already promoted him to organizer.
Oh, you already did? Okay. Yeah, so on your little window on the side, then there should have been an extra option that comes up for questions. It's a small window. What I've used, there's a little X next to it, and there's a kind of like a square with an arrow. If you click on the square with the arrow, it pops it out, and then you can make that window a little larger.
I'm not seeing that. That's okay. I'll figure it out. Oh, there it is. I see it under the panels.
Choppy. Are you hearing him choppy, Ben, or is it me?
What?
Yeah, it seems a bit choppy.
Yeah, Frank, your audio seems like it's cutting in and out a little.
Okay, I just put it on. Yeah, I wasn't really in the speaking mode.
Yeah, I don't know if that's your cell phone, or are you on a landline or a cell phone?
I'm on a landline. It's a I what do you call it? Protocol, internet protocol. It's the but I'm
interesting.
I was speaking. I was presenting. I would use a handset.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to understand what you're saying.
Okay,
as you're talking, it's very.
Can you hear me better?
A little better. I don't know if you want to try to hang up and call back. It sounds. Yeah, it sounds very choppy. We'll kind of hang tight for a second while you do that. That usually doesn't happen on my landline. Yesterday the audio was perfect for everybody.
All right. Hold on. Just call my cell phone.
I wonder if I mean, even though we call it a landline, most people's phones are actually kind of voice over IP these days if you've got fiber. So potentially, his kids are streaming Netflix in the other room and he doesn't have the bandwidth. I'm on my cell phone and it's kind of sitting in the office by the window. So it's impeded as little as possible. Andy and Guamin, for the presenters, the GoToWebinar little widget that is up on your screen that shows their names and everything, that is something that you see on your screen, but when you're presenting, the audience does not see. If you find that is in your way of your presentation and you can't see your slides behind it, on the kind of upper left-hand window, there's an orange box with a white arrow that's pointing to the right that minimizes that window to kind of slides it off and turns it into a single bar. So if you click on that, then the window goes out of your way. So you're able to present with your view being uninterrupted. When it's time to share your screen, the pop-up will still come up on your screen that says, would you like to share your screen? So you can just minimize that window and not worry about it.
Okay.
Will you be recording today?
Yes, the webinar absolutely will be recorded. I'll show that briefly during my little intro. We post them on the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety site. There's also a District 2 site for the North Florida Traffic Safety that we post them as well. But I believe the link in the meetings from GoToWebinar point only to the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety site. Are you back with us, Frank?
Oh, yes, I am.
Oh, that sounds perfect now. Yeah, that's good.
That's amazing. I only kept that landline to do webinars.
I mean, while you were off, I was saying it could be. I mean, if you have fiber optic, your landline isn't actually a copper wire. It's just going through the internet like everything else.
It definitely it will go out on occasion because it is an internet protocol. So it is hooked into my internet system. So anyway, I'm just shocked. It was.
You've got somebody in the other room was watching Netflix and stealing on your bandwidth or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cell phone's working well. I see your guys' buddy Rudy Ums is on is one of our audience members.
Great.
Ask us tough questions in the chat, okay, Rudy? We'll give everybody another minute. We'll get started. We've got 73 people on the line at the moment. We usually hover near 100, so there'll be some people that trickle in.
Yeah.
All right, I've got 5 after on my clock, so we can go ahead and begin. Ben, did you begin the recording already?
Yes, it's already recording.
Okay, great. The recording has begun, so we'll go ahead and begin the webinar. If you can share my screen, please. You're able to see my email?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, making sure I've got the correct monitor. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this April session of the 2020 Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. Today's webinar is going to be on high friction surface treatment. We have 3 folks on the line with us. I'll introduce them in a second. To talk about this, representatives from FHWA, a retired FHWA gentleman that is now a vendor for high surface friction treatment. He's going to be available for us on the line for Q&A and any other information. And we have representatives from the State Materials Office as well. Everyone in your inbox, it is here, made it here because of the email that is up on my screen. Wanted to share with you some contact information for our coordinators from our partners, Tim and Oliver. The link on the email for the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety.com website, LATSA, Local Area Traffic Safety Academy, is the location where the links and the PowerPoints and the video recording for this webinar are going to be. I'll show you what that looks like. When you click on this link, it takes you to the site that we have here, Tampa Bay Traffic Safety, under the Safety Academy. It shows the upcoming and completed webinars, webinars that we've done in the past. And halfway down the page, we have the link for the prior webinars that we've done, the 2020 ones that we've done, road safety fundamentals and highway safety manual are here. These are the presentations, and the recordings are on this side. For our folks in the north, we have kind of a parallel site for the local agency Traffic Safety Academy that has a little bit of an expanded information with the speaker bios, as well as the same links for the PDF and the presentations of the ones that we've done thus far. So our speakers for today are Our speakers for today are Andy Merginger. He is the civil engineering graduate from the University of Kansas, and a registered professional engineer. He is a senior pavement materials engineer with FHWA Resource Center. His responsibilities include the pavement surface characteristic measurements and analysis. He's the field project engineer for FHWA Friction Management Program that is demonstrating continuous friction measurements and is one of FHWA's technical points of contact for high friction surface treatment. He came to this position in 2007 after 7 years as state materials engineer for the Virginia Department of Transportation. Before Virginia, Mr. Merginger worked for FHWA for 15 years in various locations throughout the U.S. Our second presenter from the state of Florida is Dr. Guamin Wang. He is graduated from the University of Florida with a PhD in civil engineering. After graduation in 2009, Dr. Wang joined a consulting company and worked as the pavement engineer for more than 5 years. In 2015, Dr. Wang joined FDOT and worked as the State Pavement Performance Evaluation Engineer. He works with Charles Holzhauser and helps manage the statewide NDT program, including the highway friction surface treatment. Dr. Wang is currently the statewide high friction surface treatment program monitor, and he likes sharing Florida's practices with everyone, so he's excited to be part of our audience. Frank Julian, who's on the line as well, retired from FHWA in January of 2018 after 32 years. With the last 20 years in the Resource Center and the design team, he's been involved in developing and deploying numerous technologies to address roadway departure crashes. Frank was the high friction surface treatment technology leader for the Everyday Counts, the EDC2. He is currently an engineering consultant, primarily doing work with High Friction Surface Treatment Association. So we have, the three premier experts in the field of high surface friction treatment. One more management thing, and the chat pod. We have, kind of two jam-packed presentations with lots of information. We're going to get right to it. Please ask questions along the way in the chat pod. We'll be moderating those questions. If there's anything pertinent to a particular graph, I'll interrupt and we'll talk about that. But if not, I want to get through both presentations, and then we'll have a lively Q&A at the end. So please type your questions along the way as we go. With that, I'll hand it over to Andy.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and hopefully my PowerPoint presentation is up on the screen?
Yes, you're good.
All right, excellent. Thanks a lot. All right, today's discussion is on high friction surface treatments. And as you see by my title here, I'm not really going to get into what is a high friction surface treatment. Guangming is going to talk about that. I'm going to present information related to pavement friction and how you assess it. And what I'm going to discuss is kind of a novel, non-traditional friction assessment approach. Again, a high friction surface treatment enhances friction, so it would behoove us to really have an idea of what the friction is on the pavement. I am a pavements guy, not a safety folk, but I'm going to do my best here to try to present this information because you are mostly safety folks. And one thing that you all have taught me over the years is that there are many factors that influence crash risk. And so I don't want to give anybody the impression that I believe that friction is the dominant one in the majority or even any case. But whenever we're looking at enhancing friction, it would be in our best interest to get an idea of what is the friction out on the roadway, how does it possibly impact crash risk, and so I'm trying to tailor this to you. I believe that I'm probably speaking to you today because of a collaborative effort that I did with the Tampa District Traffic Safety Engineer, Peter Sue, last year, and I'll be talking about a road safety audit we did there. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. I'll just briefly go over a little bit of history to give you all some perspective on where we've been over the years with friction testing, and then just a little bit about what is friction whenever we look at it from a pavement engineering standpoint. And so I do apologize to any of my pavement engineers out there because this will be at a high level. I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty details. And then I want to share with you some data from the continuous friction measurement, which is not our traditional approach in the U.S. for highways. But I believe that it has value to us. And then a couple case studies and discuss what we see as far as crash risk analysis and how continuous friction measurement can be incorporated into your standard practices here in the U.S. from a safety analysis standpoint. All right, so with that, real quickly on history. If we look at highway engineering research in the U.S., the time that it was done at a major level within the nation, highly coordinated in all areas of highway engineering, geometric, safety, pavements, was back in the 50s and 60s. And so if you think about those days, we were preparing for the interstate era, and so there was a lot of work that was needed. And one of the things that was folks thought about was, we're now creating a high-speed roadway environment that we have not had before. And so there was great concern that there was going to be adequate safety on those roadways. And so there was a pretty major effort in friction, fundamental friction research back in those 50s and 60s. And you can see from here, kind of the first studies were in 1969 and 62. And you can see in the photo here that we have a trailer-mounted device, and that is called a locked wheel skid trailer. You can see my pointer there, and you can see the trailer, and that is what was developed back in that time frame. And as we look today, that is the standard that we currently have within the United States for highways, is a locked wheel skid trailer. It is, you apply water immediately in front of a tire, and that tire is locked up and skidded, and the data is collected at a standard speed of 40 miles an hour, which collects data over 59 feet. It's a really good test to measure that 59 feet of friction of pavement surface. It's a repeatable, a good field test, and for that 59 foot, you get a good idea of what the friction is. But that's one thing I want to present to you is that enough data to really inform us from a crash risk analysis standpoint? And also the way that the pavement friction was introduced to us in the highway community, it was really focusing on wet weather-related crashes. And you can clearly see where folks would think that wet weather crashes would be more friction related. That was how we progressed within the United States. Again, with the locked wheel skid trailer and focusing on wet weather crashes. So I've already presented very briefly that the locked wheel skid trailer is not a continuous measuring system. Again, if you're taking a test, you lock the wheel, measuring 59 feet at 40 miles an hour. So for you in the safety community, for the past 10 to 15 years, those of us in the pavement community have been recognizing that pavement surface structure, so below the surface and above the surface, changes every foot that you go down the road. So there's been a consistent theme within the pavement field measurement community to really understand that and to try to measure the pavement condition every foot as you go down the roadway. And what I've listed here are several different pavement conditions and the different technologies. We're using ground penetrating radar, traffic speed deflectometer, which is a measure of the structural strength of the pavement, segregation ride quality. Most of you have heard the International Roughness Index. So again, we're measuring every foot of the pavement to give us an idea of the riding quality. And we're doing the same things, looking at cracking and rutting. So what I'm presenting is really nothing different than what we've been doing in the past 15 years, just looking at, hey, let's take a look at friction and see what we can do to measure every foot of it, and then see potentially what is the value of that. So we started a federal highway pavement friction management study several years ago, and we had 4 states, of which Florida was one of them. And this was really more of a demonstration project. We have a continuous friction measuring system that has been used overseas for a couple decades. It's their standard practice for highways, and we were looking at what this possibly could do for us in the U.S. But we also recognize, again, friction is not going to be the driver in many situations. There's so many other roadway characteristics that really play into, and you guys in safety know that better than any of us. Your roadway geometrics, shoulder width, they all play. Horizontal curvature, vertical curvature, cross slope, play key roles in that. So we want to bring all that data together and just add friction to that. And so that's what the concept of this project was, to bring all those pieces of data together and see if we could enhance our crash risk analysis. One thing that we've talked about are friction demand categories. And what we mean by that is a recognition that every section of roadway in Florida, everywhere in the U.S. has a different friction demand. So if you think about it, if you're in a tight horizontal curve on a 2-lane, 2-way roadway, you need more friction from the pavement to keep the vehicle driving safely and under control than you would on a tangent section. So that's really what friction demand is, just the recognition that different sections of roadway, the vehicle needs a different level of friction for that. So here we go into our basic 101 on what is pavement friction whenever us pavement engineers talk about it. And so the first part is we're looking at 2 characteristics. We call them microtexture and macrotexture. And this is a pavement surface here. This is a asphalt pavement. You've got the black area is your asphalt liquid, and then these kind of orange are the aggregate. And so if you look at this microtexture here, where my highlighter is, that is the very tiny, sharp edges. So if you think about a piece of sandpaper and you rub your hand gently over the top of it and you can feel that scratching, that's microtexture. So we are very interested in the microtexture, and it's on each aggregate piece. And then we have this other area called macrotexture. And you'll see that it is the void between the aggregate. It does several things for us from a friction standpoint, but one of the predominant characteristics is it provides an area for the water to evacuate so that our rubber tires can come in contact with the pavement or with the aggregate and its microtexture. So it is a key element to evacuate water, and so it is very key is the speeds of your roadways increase. So again, you want to place in the back of your mind that macrotexture is more critical for high-speed roadways. They're more sensitive to it than lower-speed roadways, and the reason is it gives that water a chance to evacuate as the tire is progressing over it. So those are the 2 things from a pavement engineering standpoint we're interested in, is microtexture and macrotexture. Okay, so let's get into this continuous friction measurement that I've been talking about. And right here is the friction measuring system that we used in the study. You can see it's a very large rig. And the reason for that is for one reason only. We needed to carry a lot of water, because whenever we're out there doing testing, if we have to pull off every 5 or 10 or 50 miles to reload with water, we lose a lot of time in our testing. So the reason for the size is strictly to carry water. The actual testing instrument is this tire that I've got my pointer on. It is in contact with the ground continuously, and it is angled at 20 degrees to the direction of travel. And so it is measuring the forces on the tire, and what it gives you is an indication of the friction, and for this case here, it gives us an indication of microtexture. I don't want to give anybody the impression it is the only test or it is the best test to give an indication of microtexture. It's just a test, and it's the one that we used here, and we believe it gives us some good insight into microtexture. So for microtexture right now, we have to use this rubber tire on the roadway. There is no non-contact sensor to give us an indication of microtexture yet. But fortunately for macrotexture, the very standard models that we use here in the U.S. are a laser-based non-contact sensor, and it gives us an indication of macrotexture. Again, I don't want to give anybody the impression that there is only one way of assessing macrotexture, but this is a recognized way, and I don't want to give anybody the impression it is the best way to assess macrotexture from a friction standpoint. It is just one way. We have a long ways to go to figure out what is the best, but again, we're getting insight into it. So those are the two ways we are assessing microtexture and macrotexture. Now let's look at it, folding it into crash risk analysis and also the case studies. So since we're here talking about high friction surface treatments, I want to present to you information from one of the national leaders in the installation of high friction surface treatments, and that was Kentucky. They were early adopters of it, and so they have some of the best data that I've seen for the use of high friction surface treatments. So the data I'm showing you here is the crash percent reduction for 138 locations through Kentucky where they installed high friction surface treatment. And that was the only treatment done out on the roads. They did not do any sign enhancement, pavement markings. It was strictly they installed high friction surface treatment. So it's a pretty good control, tested data to show what a friction enhancement would do. One thing I'd like to highlight again is Kentucky does not do network level friction testing, so none of these locations were identified by friction testing. They were identified by other more traditional crash risk pieces of data. So if we look at their crash reductions and we look at the wet reduction in crashes for all 138 locations, a 91% crash reduction. So again, Kentucky is seeing great value in the use of high friction based on their site selection. And also, one thing we also like to bring forward is high friction is a good thing to reduce dry crashes also. So it's not just a benefit for wet crashes, we also see it as a benefit for dry crashes and overall crashes. The data that you see here includes 3 years of crash data before the installation, and the after installation data is anywhere between 3 and 6 years. So this is a pretty good data set. And as I go around the country talking with folks about high friction and continuous friction measurement, I always ask them how they identified locations for high friction. And few, if any, high friction surface treatment installation to date have been identified by network level friction testing. So that kind of gives us an indication that maybe we should be doing friction testing a little bit differently to give us some better insight. Okay, I just want to reiterate that from a friction measurement assessment, we want to be assessing the microtexture and the macrotexture. And right now, the technology for microtexture is you have to have a rubber tire in contact with the pavement. I'm not aware of any other method to do that. And for the macrotexture, luckily we have a non-contact sensor to give us an indication. So those are two pieces that we need as we're out there measuring the pavement surface. All right, I'll go through 4 case studies. One is to show you the potential value of using continuous measurements versus the discrete measurement of the locked wheel. The next one will be about the macrotexture and the value of it. And then I'll talk about what we did in Florida last year with the road safety audit. And then I'll show you some data from a high friction surface treatment installation so you get an idea of really how much friction enhancement you get from a high friction surface treatment. Okay, so for the comparison of the continuous measurement versus the locked wheel, one of our states, we asked them to collect data every mile. So every mile point, we said, lock up your locked wheel skid trailer and give us data there, and we're going to measure every foot as we go down the road. So here's a graph that I want you to get familiar with. On the horizontal axis, we have the mile marker, so you can see we're at 54, 55. So you can see we're all the way up to 61. So we have several miles of data. On the left vertical axis, we have the friction test result from 0 to 100. And the blue line here is the continuous friction measurement. And so you can see we are continuously measuring, and it does vary as you go down the roadway. Again, the continuous friction measurement here is an indication of microtexture. The yellow dots are the locked wheel skid trailer, and for this state, they use a rib tire, which is the same system that Florida uses, and it is more of an indicator of microtexture than macrotexture. So let's just look at those yellow dots. And you'll see that the first one is right on the 54-mile point, but then you'll see the next one is not at the 55, it's up around the 55.2. So there may have been something right at 55-mile point that didn't allow them to feel comfortable taking the test. And you'll see the other yellow dots, some are actually on the mile marker and some are not. If you think about testing with a trailered system, sometimes there's locations that you may not want to do testing from just a practical standpoint, but we're able to measure continuously through all those. So again, focusing on the yellow dots, you'll see that the lowest one was at 57 and it was about a 42, and then your highest one is about a 48. And whenever Guang Ming is presenting, he will talk with you about the different friction numbers they get from their tester, but kind of as a rule of thumb, if most pavement engineers were looking at those numbers, they would say overall the friction looked fairly good throughout this section. But let's now look at the continuous section. You can see here at 56.4, there's a pretty good drop in friction. Very short section, but a very good drop. And then if we go out here to 59.8, you'll see again a fairly large drop in friction at this localized location. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what is going on at mile marker 59.8. All right, for future reference, before we leave this slide, I want you to look at the right-hand vertical column, and that is mean profile depth, which is our indicator of macro texture. So all I want you to remember from this is for this section of roadway, we're measuring it continuously, and you can see that most of the readings are at 1 or above, and there are some locations that we're down to about 0.7. So just put that in your back of your mind whenever we start looking at these graphs from other locations. So the lowest was 0.7, but most of them were around 1 for macro texture. All right, let's go ahead and take a look and see what's going on at 59.8. You can see the image here. There's actually a lot going on. We have a vertical curve, a horizontal curve, and an intersection. So from a crash risk standpoint, this is definitely more than what you would have on a tangent section without curvature or intersection. So it is you need more friction in this location because you have more activities going on. And then what does our friction data show? It shows that we have the least amount of friction in this area at this location. So if we look at an NCHRP report from 1967, and I'll give you time so you can read this statement here. But again, this was recognized back in 1967 that due to the polishing effects of the tires, whenever you're on a high-speed road, curves and intersections, so where the tires are putting more stresses on your pavement surface, in other words, it's polishing the pavement surface more in these locations in a tangent section, you're going to have your lower friction values there. And from a friction demand standpoint, this is really where you need your highest friction available on your pavement surface. So from a pavement friction assessment standpoint, these locations are ones that you really want to be measuring the friction through to get an idea, is friction a potential indicator of something going on here? Again, I want to highlight this is from a 1967 NCHRP report. And with this data here, it shows that that statement is correct with the data that we collect. And what this graph shows here is just the number of crashes 3 years before we did the testing, and this was one of the higher crash location sites. So again, I don't want to give anybody the impression that, I believe that friction is the overwhelming cause of it, but with friction data, now we can make a more informed decision on what our potential crash reduction treatments that we can do. Now we're going to go into macro texture and the value for it. Here we have a roadway. You can see at night, and the pavement looks fairly shiny, and it was a little bit of time after the rain had occurred. So just a wet pavement, shiny, rain has stopped, but still the pavement is still wet. So that's an indication that maybe macro texture has not removed all the water. So why is it important? If we look at this photo here, we have a tire traveling from left to right. And so if we have a wet pavement, immediately in front of it in this zone of 1, we have the macro texture and the rubber tire removing the water from the pavement surface, so that in the zone 2, the micro texture can then come in contact with the rubber tire so that we can maintain a good level of friction. So again, just want to highlight one of the key values of macro texture, and also, as you can imagine, the faster your speed, the more critical it is to have that adequate macro texture to remove that water. All right, so let's look at some data. This is data from 33 miles of roadway. All 33 miles were paved in the same year with the same asphalt pavement type. So there's no change in the asphalt pavement through this 23 miles. If you look here, you'll see the ADT, or these sections are essentially the same. So again, I want to highlight that, as close as we can get, the only major significant difference from the two sections of roadways is the speed limit. So we have 9 miles at 55 miles per hour, and then 24 miles at 70 miles per hour. This is a contiguous section in a suburban, rural, kind of rolling terrain environment. So just want to highlight the key difference here is the speed limit. And what happened is the crashes started to go up shortly after the paving project. So the state requested some testing and evaluation to come in. And so that's where the data set came from. All right, so let's look at some of the data. We have 3 years of before paving crash data. And so you can see where my highlighter is here. If you look at the wet crashes before paving, the wet crash rate was 28%. After paving, we only have 1.2 years because they requested this assessment before the 3-year period. So I don't want to give anybody the impression this is 3 years of after data, but this is 1.2 years of after crash data. And the wet crash rate was 29%, so essentially the same. Now let's look at how many wet crashes per year per mile, and you can see that it went from 1.2 to 1.9. Now let's look at this friction data. This is the continuous friction data, and you can see it varies between 51 and 57. So if you think about it, it's only 1.2 years the pavement has been down, so you would not expect much polishing to occur. And I think that's what you see with this number here is that the micro texture is all above 50, and you don't have any of those low spots that I showed you on the last graph. Now let's look at the macro texture, 0.37 to 0.40. So if you think back to that last graph, a lot of the macro texture there was the one at 1.0, and the lowest was at a 0.7. Now let's look at our 70-mile-an-hour sections. When we look at the wet crash percent, we see that it was 42% wet crash ratio before paving, and after paving, it was 67% wet crash ratio. Now let's look at how many wet crashes per year per mile. Before the paving, it was 1.55. After the paving, it was 5.38, and this is the reason why the state asked us to go in and do some assessment. Let's look at the friction measurement, and you'll see it's 60, very consistent, 60 throughout. So again, it's the same, if not more, from a micro texture standpoint. And if you look at your macro texture, it is essentially the same as the 55. So here's one that we believe that the macro texture may be playing a role in the crash risk. Again, the higher speed macro texture is more critical from a crash risk standpoint. All right, now we're going to get in and we're going to talk about the experience we had in Florida with the conventional road safety audit. Florida has a long history of road safety audits. Tampa District has done many of them. And we did continuous friction measurement in the Federal Highway Project, and so that we had some continuous friction data in some of their intersections. And so Florida's asked us to come down, include the friction measurement along with the standard road safety audit at several signalized intersections. And so from a road safety audit, this was the first time that continuous pavement friction data was included. So it was a standard road safety audit. The only thing that was incorporated additional was this type of continuous friction data that I showed you, and we did several locations in the Tampa area. All right, so let's look and see what we saw. Okay, there's a lot of information here, and this is at one location. So let's look at this top photo. You can see it is a urban area, signalized intersections that are very close to each other. And then we color-coded the friction, the continuous friction data, and the macro texture data. So let's look at the friction data. And we just put some color codes on here to make it easier for folks to understand. I don't want to give anybody the impression these are really color-coded from a crash risk analysis, but we just want to give you an easy overview of it. So if we look at friction, it is the lower color coding. So you can see it's yellow, orange, yellow, green, and then it changes color through here. So that's the friction. So you can see in this area here, the friction is around that 50 to 55 or higher. And that is essentially this. In the lower left hand, you can see my laser pointer, and that is this asphalt pavement section in here. And I want to make it clear that all this asphalt pavement was paved at the same time, same mix. So the only change from a friction to macro texture is due to the traffic. It is the same mix and same type. Now let's look at the macro texture, and that is the top color coding. And you can see that it is mostly orange and yellows and reds. So it is in that 0.4, 0.6 type of range. All right, now let's get into the data a little bit more. Okay, hopefully you're getting more familiar with these plots. This is a continuous friction measurement, and you can see it continuously measures, and it does change as we go through. And here is the intersection of interest to us. It's up here about this 12.6, 12.7 area. And if you look at the friction, it's varying from about 52 down to about 40, and the macro texture is going from about 0.7 down to about 0.3 in this area. So this is the area of interest to us. The 51 here is the number of crashes in the 3-year time frame for that 1/10 of a mile. So again, it looks like we have a change in friction in this area. And let's take a little bit closer look at it here and see what's going on. Here we are approaching the first signalized intersection. And you can see up in the upper right-hand corner here, this is a bus stop. It is a slight downgrade to this bus stop. And you can see that this is mile marker 12.55, and our continuous friction reading is 44. And the macro texture is 0.34, and that is in this location at the stop bar at this bus stop. Now we're just going to go down to this area here where these cars are, and you can see my pointer. Again, the same pavement surface, same construction, but here's what happens to the friction. It's now the continuous friction measurement is up around 54, and the macro texture is 0.7. So we believe this is a good indication of that polishing that occurs from the vehicle tires that occurred at that intersection. And here we don't have that same action. So we have a different friction measurement here. Now we're going to go to this next section of pavement, which is concrete. So this is asphalt, and now we're going to go onto a concrete, and we're going to see that the friction measurement there was at 39, and the macro texture was down to 0.28. So again, I just want to highlight that this is a good example of an intersection that it appears that the tire scrubbing has created a differential friction situation as you go through the intersection. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with the road safety audit, and I can tell you this was the first time I was ever in a road safety audit, being a pavement engineer. It was a good mix of interdisciplinary groups, including law enforcement, maintenance, safety, operations, pavements and materials. We had 2 independent groups so that we hopefully would be reviewing them without having bias throughout both groups. We had 2 groups. We all looked at the same intersections, the same data, but we did it as 2 independent groups, and then we came together afterwards in a meeting, and then we shared notes and came to a conclusion. So we were out on the roadway, and we looked for all different things that you really can't see from your office, in pedestrian crossings, bicycle, how do the signs look? Do we have enough sight distance? What does the pavement look like? So just, again, a very traditional road safety audit, except for we added the continuous friction measurement data to the data set. The group all came to the same recommendation that we believe that a high friction surface treatment would hopefully reduce the crashes in these locations. And that was because of really driven by the friction data that we had, and also that there were a high rear end crash types at these intersections. And so the folks felt that enhanced friction would hopefully reduce those rear end type crashes. So you can see here at the Hillsborough Avenue, there were a few other safety related, operations related enhancements that were being discussed. And then at the Central Avenue intersection, which a project was advertised in April of 2020, and Hillsborough at George also is a high friction surface treatment only project, and it's being advertised now. So the outcome was, I think it was really driven by having that continuous friction data that the group felt, let's give high friction surface treatment a try here, and let's see if it can reduce our crashes. Okay, now I'm going to show you some high friction surface treatment data so that you have a good idea of how all these numbers are playing out. You saw various numbers. Now I'm going to show you the high friction and see how it changes. All right, so hopefully you're familiar with this graph. The blue is the continuous friction measurement, and as soon as we get to the high friction, you can see it shoots from 45 up to about 100, and then it comes back down and stabilizes around 85. So you can see very clearly that high friction is a significant increase in friction from a traditional pavement surface. And here, if we look at the macro texture is all above 1 for the high friction also. And so what high friction surface treatment does for you, it gives you both extremely good micro texture and it gives you good macro texture. So it's a surface treatment that gives you the two key characteristics that we look at from a pavement engineering standpoint for friction. And the yellow dots are the lockable skid trailer, and you can see that the lockable skid trailer also recognized that significant increase in friction. So again, this gives us good data to show that the high friction gives us a significant increase over a traditional pavement. The continuous measurement shows you that you can see where that change is very quickly. And so one of the things that we also believe the continuous can tell you is where you should start and stop your high friction surface treatment installation whenever you decide to put one in. For example, if we look here at right around the 0.55 mile mark to 0.6, we dropped down to below 40, so maybe it would have been in the best interest to extend the high friction to 0.6. But again, what we see is that we believe continuous friction can give you not only information to assess whether or not friction may be an issue, but also if you decide to install some friction enhancement treatment, where the limits of that treatment should go. Okay, so what are other countries doing? This is a standard investigatory level for friction thresholds from the United Kingdom. They use the same friction measurement system that this data is from. They've been doing it for over 20 years. And so over the years, they've come up with a breakdown of friction demand categories. So that's what A, B, C, Q, all these are different friction demand categories. And give you the example, motorway is what we would call an interstate roadway on a tangent section. And so you can see that they're saying that if the friction is below 0.3, 0.35, that it may be an area of concern. So it is your lowest investigatory level, but it's your highest speed. But because it's a tangent section, the friction demand is not that great. Now if we go to let's go to C, which is a single carriageway non-event. So that would be a two-lane, two-way roadway without an intersection, without horizontal or vertical curvature, just a tangent, two-lane, two-way roadway. And you can see that their friction demand is a little bit higher. And that's because it's a two-lane roadway versus an interstate. Now let's go down to S1, and that's a bend radius of less than 500 meters on a dual carriageway. So this would be your four-lane divided highway with a curve of less than 500 meters. And you can see again, their investigatory level for friction is up around 0.45, 0.5. So again, over the years, they've looked at their data, they've looked at their crashes, and this is their investigatory level. So if they have a friction measurement, and what they look at is they average the friction data over 10 meters. And so where they have a friction test result over those 10 meters less than these numbers, that will institute an investigation at that site. And here is a traditional safety performance function that is used within the U.S. from a crash risk analysis. And what we believe is that the friction data and the texture data can easily be folded into this traditional crash risk analysis model, just like horizontal curvature, vertical curvature, shoulder width, lane width, all those other roadway variables to give you an idea of your crash risk. So from a crash risk analysis, we believe you can take the continuous friction data and incorporate it into your standard crash risk analysis models as they sit. So we think it should be facilitate implementation in that manner. And so to wrap up with my discussion here, back in 1967, the NCHRP Report 37 highlighted friction demand concept, and that where you have the highest friction demand, there's a good chance that you have the lowest available friction on the roadway because of all that tire pavement interaction. And again, I want to highlight that just because you have low friction data is not an automatic reason to invest in a treatment. It is just one piece of the puzzle, and it is a very complex puzzle. Also want to highlight that the lockable skid trailer is a very high quality test for that discrete measurement. The United Kingdom, they use the lockable skid trailer for research purposes. They do not use it in their production testing, but they use it for research. It's challenging to take tests at these critical locations. And again, I think the continuous friction measurement shows that friction does change at certain locations to where the value of continuous, we believe, should be investigated further. And again, I want to highlight that we need to bring together all the roadway information, not just the friction data, but also the roadway geometrics to really make a more informed decision. And the great benefits that many states have seen from high friction surface treatment installations to date leads us to believe that there are certain locations that a friction enhancement would reduce our crash risk. So with that, that's all that I have right now. Thank you.
I think I see there's questions in the chat about his presentation that we're going to go ahead and go to Guaming's presentation, and then maybe some of the questions will be answered, and the Q&A in the end will be more of a panel discussion as we move on, so we can share Guaming's screen.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Guangwing.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Once you click the slideshow, we will see full screen.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure, to share, Florida's half-grain surface treatment, experience and the program here. My name is Guaming Wang, and I work at State Material Office as a pavement performance evaluation engineer. I work with Charles Hochul and monitor statewide half-grain surface treatment program. So the topic of today's presentation is half-grain surface treatment, Florida practice, and the safety performance analysis. So here's agenda. First, I will introduce some background on half-grain surface treatment. Then I will talk about in the Florida half-grain surface treatment practice, including the Florida half-grain surface treatment program. After that, the safety performance analysis will be presented. And to the end of the safety performance analysis, I will present the 2 case studies. And finally, I will cover some potential challenge we are facing on half-grain surface treatment in practice today, with some recommendations to conclude today's presentation. So what is the half-grain surface treatment? Half-grain surface treatment is the thin overlay of high-quality, polish-resistant aggregate bonded to the pavement surface with polymer resin bind it is a site-specific applications to restore and enhance pavement surface friction. Most half-skin surface treatment were implemented on curves or ramps where demand high friction. And it is one of FHWA everyday count innovations and has been promoted by FHWA, aggressively, and has demonstrated successfully on reducing the crashes, injuries, fatalities associated with the pavement friction issues. The estimated service life is about 7 to 10 years. Here shows some the pictures and a short video of on-site half-skin surface treatment application video. So the half-skin surface first introduced in Florida in 2006. Up to 2019, we have 28 mainline projects in total. So here shows the map of statewide distribution of half-skin surface treatment projects. As you can see, each district has at least one half-skin surface treatment project. In Florida, most of half-skin surface treatment were implemented on ramps. Very few were implemented on the intersection, tangent approach, and horizontal curves. As you can see, from this, figure, 20 projects were implemented on ramp. 3 projects were implemented on the horizontal curve. 3 projects implemented on the intersection and on the tangent approach, and 2 projects were implemented on the intersections. So during the early age of half-skin surface treatment implementations, we had some premature failures, such as bleeding, aggregate loss, and delamination. To address those premature failures, FDOT carried out a research with TTI and developed the half-skin surface treatment guidelines, and also updating the specification. So we specify material requirement, the existing pavement condition, and to be overlaid, and application method. For instance, manual application is not applicable. It's no longer acceptable for projects over 200 square yards. Instead, automatic application is required to enhance the consistency. Now let's talk about the Florida half-skin surface treatment program. So we developed the half-skin surface treatment in the SharePoint website. The customer can submit the half-skin surface treatment request online, and the SMO will get a notice immediately. So depending on the conditions, we request the customer to submit one or more of the following documents on SharePoint for preliminary assessment. Safety study with crash diagram, cost-benefit analysis, friction report, cross slope with drainage analysis report, and the pavement condition report. So the crash diagram show including the last 3 and 5-year or 5-year crash events. Should some statistic on the wet the crash, dry crashes, roadway departure crashes. The cost-benefit analysis shall be performed to make sure the benefit-cost ratio is greater than 1.5 at the minimum. Sometimes we also request friction report to check whether the friction is greater than 35 or not. So if necessary, we also require cross-slope and grade measurement and perform drainage analysis to make sure drainage is not the major issue for the crashes. If the half-cone surface treatment is overlaid on the existing pavement, we request pavement condition report to make sure the existing pavement is either dense grade or the regional pavement. The PCS rating is good or above. There's no structural damage, and the overall cracking percentage should be less than 6%. Based on submitted documents, SMO will hold a teleconference with customers to discuss half-cone surface treatment candidates, application conditions, and the limits, the conceptual plan, and help agency make final decision. Here shows an example of proposed application limits. So we also develop statewide half-cone surface treatment tracking system to track performance. This system includes the project locations, material information, and the half-cone surface vendor information. The system is also linked to the GIS map, which allows the user to visualize locations online. So we also develop the database for the friction and texture, so that we can compare friction and texture of half-cone surface treatment with traditional pavement. As shown in this figure, the friction of half-cone surface treatment, in this case, in the figure represented by the green square, is about 50% to 100% greater than the traditional pavement. Interestingly, the macro texture of the half-cone surface treatment in terms of mean profile depth greater than dense grade and regional pavement, and close to open grade. So which indicates the half-cone surface treatment also has good drainage properties. This conclusion is the same as pointed out by the Andy in the previous presentation. So eventually, we want to know what is the crash performance of half-cone surface treatment. So we did safety performance analysis. The challenge here is how to check the crash performance of each half-cone surface treatment site dynamically. So we come up with a methodology. Basically, we link Florida crash database with half-cone surface treatment sites and compare number of crashes before the treatment and after treatment. So based on this methodology, we develop an access tool which allows users to define a time period, say 3 years or 5 years, and to compare number of crashes before the treatment and after treatment. It should be noted, some projects may not have the 3 or 5 years of crash history after treatment. Say a project, for example, a project that was built in 2018, it only has 2 years of crash data. In this case, it has to be normalized to 5 years. So we also don't consider new project with less than 1 year old, because we think that's not enough treatment, the time after treatment to illustrate the crash performance. So here's the results of 5-year mainline the half-cone surface treatment crash performance. As you can see, for all mainline half-cone surface treatment projects, including ramps, tangent approaches, and intersections, the overall crash reduction was 43%. For the curved ramps only, the crash reduction even big is 69% under all conditions. Now for the tangent approach, including the intersections, the crash reduction is 23% under all conditions. But under the wet condition only, the overall reduction is 77% for all half-cone surface treatment projects. Now, for the curve ramps under wet conditions, the overall crash reduction is 90%. So it's pretty significant. And also for the tinging approach under wet conditions, the crash reduction is 55%. So to sum it up, here's a summary. For curved sections, the overall crash reduction is 69% under all conditions and 90% under wet conditions only. For tangent sections, the crash reduction is not as significant as curved sections, but still we get 23% crash reduction under all conditions and 55% under wet conditions only. So I would also like to share two cases here. One is the Lawyer Palm Boulevard to R75 northbound ramp. This project was built in 2006 and still in service. It's still performing very well with friction number more than 60. So overall, the yearly crash the reduction is 45%. Another project is R275 southbound in the off ramp at the Memorial Highway to the Tampa International Airport. The district office, safety office, they did crash analysis. It turns out the overall yearly crash reduction is 69% and 93% under wet condition, which is pretty close to our the steel material office crash performance analysis. So although the half-cone surface treatment has some significant safety benefits, but we do have some challenge during the implementations. And one of the challenge is high cost. As you can see, the average unit cost for half-cone surface treatment is about $46 per square yard, which is almost 10 times more than thin overlay. It is also more expensive than the national average, which is about $30 per square yard. Florida, in this case, is kind of unique. The half-cone surface treatment was built, as subcontractor to the prime contractor, which may lead to the high bidding cost. In the future, we may separate half-cone surface treatment and asphalt paving and bind half-cone surface treatment project together for bidding, so which may reduce the cost, the total cost. So another solution will be developing asphalt mixture with calcium bauxite as an alternative to the half-cone surface treatment to popularize the half-cone surface treatment application. So another challenge is the maintenance and the rehabilitation strategy. With more and more half-cone surface treatment projects approaching to the end of surface life, what are the maintenance and the rehabilitation strategy? Milling or micro milling, those type of questions need to be answered in the future. Fortunately, we have some research projects. We have research projects to address a challenge like this. So to sum up, half-cone surface treatment is the greatest safety treatment, and it is most cost effective on tight curves. Although there are some challenges, we strongly recommend to implement half-cone surface treatment on locations where demand half friction, and in particular on those locations with high frequency of crashes. With that, I will conclude today's presentation, and I open to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. That's a great slide to just leave it on there. Thank you. Questions, and we'll get into the Q&A portion of the webinar. We've got a couple of notes that have come in. Kudos to both presenters. There's been good comments about great information. Thank you so much for the information. For anybody that is asking in the chat pod as well, both presentations, the PDF version of them have been added to the handout pod. So on your GoToWebinar application, both presentations are there. As we mentioned earlier in the introduction, they will also be posted to the website. There is a link in the invitation to this webinar to that website. So the recording and the presentations will be posted there as well. So to the questions, what is the best practice? What is the best way for public agencies to decide if a high friction surface treatment is needed at intersection approaches? I don't know who wants to chime in and take that.
One of the Anthony, this is Frank. I'll throw in an answer on that one. Again, if you look at what lessons learned we saw in Tampa, I think it's a good example. It looks really as how the traffic operates. Where you have a scenario there, you look at what are the queue links, what's the volume, what's the speed, and it really is relative to the aggregate that you have in place. And again, using the continuous friction measuring device is ideal because it literally gives you a good starting and stopping place. Again, Andy points out a lot of great tips there to look at, and one is, of course, macro texture. And, you know, that can be an issue by itself. And so high friction does have a good macro texture. But, you know, again, I point out that high friction it's kind of like the ultimate solution. And if you don't necessarily always have to have the ultimate solution. For intersections, I think it's going to be a lot depending on operating speed, which obviously drives the braking aspect, but also the volume. You look at some of the roads that are continuous, heavy traffic all day long with a lot of braking, it's just going to polish that pavement out quicker than it would elsewhere. So that's really the key. But you know, in a unique scenario, you can look at unique conditions where you have shorter stopping sight distance and things like that, downhill grades. Those are all areas where you might look at that a little differently. The ones that Andy mentioned, none of that occurs. It's just volume and speed.
That's interesting. And each of the presentations they're kind of. Oh, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, you know, the ending, the Franklin, you know, make a good point, you know, but I also want to, you know, mention, you know, at the intersection, the braking distance, you know, is one of, you know, the probably, you know, affect, you know, the influence, you know, the crash, cause the crash. So, but I think in the TTI, you know, they did some, you know, did some, you know, the experiment, you know, testing. And it turns out, you know, the high-friction surface treatment can, you know, in terms of the braking distance, can be, you know, 20%, you know, the 20%, you know, shorter, you know, than you know, the traditional pavement, like, you know, the regional pavement or the, you know, dense grade, you know, or open grade asphalt pavement. So the brake texture, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me add a little caveat to what you just said, which is, you know, excellent point, is that, yeah, in 2013, when TTI did the test on the braking distance, they found a reduction of 25 to 30% when you use high friction. And really, it's just the friction number versus what I considered really an excellent number. I mean, they were comparing it to a section of pavement that normally had what, by anybody's stretch of the imagination, was a good friction number. Actually, an excellent friction number for conventional pavements. It was about a 52 on a skid trailer, which is the same method Florida uses. And you know, that's everybody would be happy to have that normally. But what they found is a 25 to 30% shorter stopping distance by going to a high friction.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're having a lot of rear ends, people are making snap decisions. Sometimes it's not always about the pavement. You're basically, the design actually can create conditions for the pavement that you cannot, you know, we always go back to the weakest link is our drivers. We tend to, you know, not always have the conditions that we need for a given number of drivers.
it's interesting that, from one side we're talking about the intersections, on the other side we're talking about the tight curves as being the best locations. So, I mean, it does seem like this helps all locations, on the tangents, on the intersections, and on the tight curves.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, Anthony. The reason that the EDC2 focused on curves so much is because, number one, in intersections, there's a lot of things that contribute to crashes. There's a lot, and whenever you look at a curve, there's less variables, although in some cases, the ramps, for example, that can be a little bit more complicated. But what happens is that in curvature, we've experienced more severe crashes. So consequently, the payoff on reduction to high injury and fatal crashes is really high in curves. So it really, if you look at driving the numbers down, plus we didn't really have, beyond affecting the driver with chevrons and markings and things of that nature, we really didn't have a thing. We also know that, based on what Andy talked about, you can see that was a great example there from one of the states he showed, where you have an intersection and a curve. That kind of scenario, that's the extreme polishing, and so we do know that we do get polishing. But typically most of the polishing occurs just past the PC. That's usually if you don't have other complications in the curve. So those tend to be it's just where we wear the pavement, and of course, you make the pavement slick as ice, and you're going to have a lot of crashes. And that's a physics thing where most of the time we're looking at, in safety, we tend to focus more on driver, issues, driver error. And so consequently, this is one of those where if you have a physics issue, if the conditions are the same, you're going to have a lot of crashes.
Speaking of icy roads, there was some questions for our northerners. How does high surface friction treatment behave under snowy conditions, and how is it impacted by plowing?
This is Andy.
Great. Yes.
I can tell you that South Dakota installed some high friction surface treatments specifically for snow and ice events, and it's kind of it's in definitely a rural area, as you would expect. And what I recall, the sections had pretty good horizontal and vertical curvature, very high speed. And to date, they are very pleased that those high friction surface treatments have reduced crash risk in snowy and cold situations. And so they are under plow, and so they are happy with the under plowing also. So that's the only installation I know about in the U.S. Where the install was specifically for snowy and icy roads.
Yeah, Andy, just to add a note to that, if anybody wants a copy of that South Dakota report, it's on the Federal Highway website. So you can they found about a 79% reduction after a 3-year evaluation. Now, they had already been doing an ice and snow study, and this was, trying to come up with solutions. What they found is when crashes occur on ice and snow, because if you've got a roadway covered with ice, that's not going to affect it. But what they found is most of their crashes occurred at the beginning of an ice and snow event, at the end of the ice and snow event. In other words, basically traffic was then exposed. There were very few crashes during the actual ice event. So if you say we're going to put high friction and you're going to cover it with ice, it's going to do any good? No. But if you look at what happens at the beginning and end of that, that's where most of their crashes were occurring. That was the explanation, because I was like, well, that can't make any difference. But it does in an overall cycle of an event.
Real basic question that I don't know was covered. What is the lifespan of the treatment? I mean, how quickly does it wear out? Does it last a long time?
One of the ones that I have used as example is the one that was mentioned in the presentation. That's the one that's got some pretty heavy traffic on it. The Royal Palms at I-75 has been in since June of 2006 and still working very well. A lot of the friction treatments you can get, they work good initially, but they don't last as long. And that's really the key to this. We've got, on and on. That 7 to 10 year estimate was based on some of the original work done in the UK. And that actually, they have 2 different types of bond material. one is very traditional to what we have. The other is more like it's a little different. It's a hot applied. It doesn't last as long. So their average lifespan was lower when we were reading the original information. When you first start a program, you don't really know how long it's going to last. But we started to get some of these projects that are lasting quite a while. Now, the biggest thing is, I think when we first started our program, we saw the safety benefits initially, but we were putting it everywhere. We weren't necessarily understanding all the things we needed to know about placement. And I think, as time's gone on, number one, we're getting better binder. We're even using better aggregate. It's all, you can call calcine bauxite, but it is still actually working better. And then the second thing is that, so we're smarter. We know what causes some of the problems. I have a list for a presentation I was going to do. They got canceled for Safer Roads this year. And basically the 5 reasons high friction fails. And this is the lessons we've learned, because as a safety engineer, when I was with Federal Highway, we basically saw this works great and we're all excited about it. And then, some of them didn't last. And we're like, okay, that's not good. And so we started, the safety part's easy. The getting to last was the issue. And there's been an evolution of equipment, materials, and understanding of selection places. How to make it last longer. If you don't have that best solution, how do we go about it? And Florida has one of the key examples of understanding that they started their program that Kwame mentioned a while ago. They started in 2015 when they modified their procedure at the DOT. It's going to buy them a much longer life. Recently, the UK put out some information when they use the same type of high friction that we do, using an epoxy-based type of binder, they're getting about 12 years minimum. So that's an average of about 12 years, I would say. Not minimum, but an average, about 12 years. So that's pretty darn good.
Yeah, this is Kwame again. I want to add in some point here. It's obviously in the service life is related to the traffic. Heavy traffic, you probably have the shorter in the service life, and but light traffic you have the longer in the service life. And other thing we learn in Florida during the early the implementation, we find that the manual application will the affect the consistency of the and also the service life of the high friction surface treatment. So in the specification, so we require the automatic application for the project greater than 200 square yards. Also, we found when the high friction surface treatment in Florida, when you put on the open grade friction cost, it turns out the surface life is not as good as dense grade, because could be of the water the pour pressure, or the riving of the open grade frictions. So we in the specification we specify high friction surface treatment is not recommended to put on the open grade friction cost. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment too. Florida has been very good about putting in projects that were early into the program, so they learned some of the hard lessons. I guess I hate to say that, but that's the way it works. Things that we don't advise to do. But what they also continue to do, the way Florida's set up, they tend to let high friction as a part of a paving project. Keep in mind, this is, you don't do this for paving, you do this for safety. I mean, it's just like buying an attenuator for the road. You don't necessarily expect that's going to be competitive with other things. You're doing it because your conditions are severe and you need to address it, specifically. And so this particular scenario down there, though, is when you let a contract into a general contract, and it's a small part of the project, which generally it is, general contractors will tend to mark it up. We've seen it marked up. High friction guys are frustrated in Florida because they give good prices, similar to what they give all across the country, but then the price to the state is marked up so much that it looks bad in price. I can tell you, what the prices are around the different states in the country. People who lump their projects together and bid them to the installer direct generally come out with really excellent prices. So I would say probably close to half of what you guys are getting. Now, so what does that tell you? It's quantity, because there's a mobilization issue. So the bigger the quantity you're letting, so what we see in a lot of states is they'll let like maybe 20 locations or 10 locations or whatever in a contract. They may be all around the county. They may be some states is district wide. Kentucky just let 4 district wide contracts a couple of weeks ago. So they're getting much better prices than you for high friction. There's about 2 states that I know that continue to do this way. And I just, when you want to talk about price, there's a couple of things you don't want to do if you want to try to address your price. The way that you're, doing it is maybe the easiest way to get a project, into the bid list. I know that's an issue. So I know that's an issue that everybody has to fight to get their projects out there. But, we have some states, one that just let Minnesota not too long ago, where it was in 3 counties. It was a federally funded, HFST funded contract where they were letting projects scattered around 3 different counties. The counties kind of came together to work with the state to get the best prices. So there's a lot of ways to do this that make it more economical.
With some of those lessons learned that you mentioned, as the high friction surface treatment ages, can you overlay new, better treatment, or do you need to mill off the old before applying new?
I would micromill it off if it's been down for a long period of time. And I tell you why, because Florida also sponsored one of the best pieces of information we have at the NCAT test track. It was they were salvaging a testing area. They put it down with not the greatest epoxy, but it was what was, on the market at the time. They put it down in 2005. They took it off in 2013. Now, keep in mind, this is an accelerated loading test track, nothing but tractor trailers. And by the way, this was in a curve, so it was a worse condition. And so it had like 30 million E-sals on it, which, that doesn't really, the weight is not the issue. It's the number of trips and the friction demand that you create in a curve with a tractor trailer, which is higher than it is with a regular automobile. So consequently, they didn't polish the calcined bauxite out. That wasn't how they lost friction. They were losing friction. What they did is you start losing particle. Why? Because epoxy, as it ages, gets hard. And as it gets hard, it starts to lose particle. So there's 2 ways to lose friction. One is polishing. It doesn't happen with calcined bauxite, with the proper calcined bauxite, although there's some people who sell stuff that you got to watch. But the number 2 way is lose particle. Now, that's an extreme case, and they got, basically 8 years out of that. And so it's an extreme case. I've never seen that happen. By the way, high friction, while we really just been recently really talking about it, it's been around for a long time. It's been out there on bridge decks to some degree, even with a different aggregate. The process is the same. So we know kind of how this works when it comes to that. But if you look at it from that scenario, I would not, knowing what I just said, I would not overlay that. Now, I've had a couple of occasions where a couple of states, I would say, I don't know if they made the wrong decision or whether they were, misled. They ended up using the wrong aggregate. It was a new installation, but it polished out within a year. They didn't use calcined bauxite. And so that one, if you have enough macro texture, you could overlay that and probably be pretty good. That's the only. But if I've got a number of years, I'd mill it off and start over.
Back to our friends in the north with the icy and the. Are there any chance of the treatment kind of popping off because of the freeze and thaw cycles?
We don't see that. There's delamination issues with this product, and it's usually when the moisture gets underneath it, or either that it wasn't prepared properly when it was put down. because once it locks down, it's probably better than pavement because it has a higher tensile strength. So generally, the only time you really have a problem with that popping off is if moisture can get underneath it. Okay, and now if you're, that's one of the things you have to look at is what kind of pavement you're using and are you actually sealing it off? Because keep in mind, this product originated as a bridge deck preservation. It evolved to a safety product when we discovered calcined bauxite. Now, the scenario is that if you put this down, you really need to be aware of, number one, how it works, and and if you look for water issues, that's probably the worst scenario. If you get spot delamination, that's probably a preparation issue, or it could be an epoxy mixing issue if you're using a manual process or semi-automated, because those use a little different process. What Florida uses is automated, which is a blending apparatus that makes it more foolproof as far as getting the mixture right. You can have a failure with an epoxy formulation issue. That's easy enough to spot generally, though, if you're inspecting your project as it goes in.
So like the reports from the North Dakota reports that say that they have increase in potholes due to increased macro surface. That's not expected. Like you shouldn't have potholes. The joke, of course, being, that actually improves your macro surface, right? Because potholes it also decreases your travel speed and increases safety. So.
Right. There's a relationship between speed and if I understood that question, there's a relationship between speed and friction issues and how it performs. And that's a known physics relationship, so it's not a variable. But whenever you have, like, if you've got, I know North Dakota's got a project coming up to bid. If you ever look at this, the first one, by the way, congratulations to them. If you ever look at this from a standpoint of this is not a structural product. It is like a piece of sandpaper you're putting on your pavement. All the structure comes from your pavement. Do not look at this as repairing pavement. It is strictly to serve as a safety feature. Now, obviously, it helps operations as well. But if you've got bad pavement, this is not what you want to do, okay? If you have, and don't get me wrong, you don't have to be pristine. We've got some good life out of some projects, but there is some preparation work if the pavement is not as in good a shape. But like Florida, the way you guys are doing it is, I think, really smart for the long term because you're preparing your pavement to the best it can be, really, in curves at least. So because you're generally having open grade, and open grade, what we usually find is we end up going and treating an open grade after it's been down a while, and generally it's halfway through its life or later, and you're attaching to open grade is very weak. Now, you don't see that up in North Dakota, I'm sure. Most of your snowy, icy states don't use open grade, but I'm just pointing out the concept is understanding where the water's going, because this material will seal water out. So, that's a good thing. But by the same token, it can seal water in. If you've got moisture coming up through the pavement underneath, it will fail really quick because it will get stripping in the pavement. You'll see the material pop off. You go over, you look at it, and the pavement is stuck to the back of the high friction. It's just going to cause stripping at the pavement level if you get moisture through the pavement. So that's one thing I caution everybody about, is particularly at the lower level roadways, always understand your pavement condition. That doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's a disaster. Okay? So stay away from that, but it's an easy fix, and it's easy to understand if you just know to look for it.
Yeah, I think in in Florida, we these two documents. One is half-skin surface treatment guidelines. The other, the development specification 333. We specify the pavement condition to be overlaid, existing pavement condition to be overlaid. That should be no structural damage, and the overall pavement condition should be good or above, and also that's the cracking should be, the overall cracking should be less than 6%. So if you have some cracking, less than 6%, you need to seal the cracking before you put in half-skin surface treatment.
For our Florida audience,
you.
Dr. Wong, do you know the number of available high friction surface contractors in Florida? Is there what's a good resource for finding contractors to do work in Florida?
I think probably Frank, you probably know better than me. But
yes, I do.
In Florida, yeah, okay.
Florida uses a qualified bidders list on this, or qualified installers list, I should say, and I think Charles's office, which is Guaming's office, basically keeps that list, and that would be the place to go to get the list of those. And keep in mind, all the people who do this, there's some local people that get involved, which sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes it is, and it's okay. But the folks that do this work all over the country. They're big contractors. They're even though the high friction may be a small part of their company, they do multiple things. There's a lot of contractors, that are involved in this high friction industry. They're scattered everywhere around the country. But they work. Florida's, a lot of those projects are going in Florida are being, done by people from outside of Florida.
In Florida and elsewhere, we've been talking a lot about the local roads. Are we tracking projects off system as well, or is this mainly an on system effort thus far?
I think the both, the on system and off system, it depends. If the local in the office, they think based on the crash the diagram, based on the crash events, they think the friction or pavement surface friction caused the problem, and they will contact us, with doing some the friction test, and then we will discuss with the result with them and propose some solutions to them. And obviously half-skin surface treatment is one of the options.
I only know of a couple that so far that have been in development, Anthony. In one, I think is a great example. Was in Destin, Florida, and that one's still yet to go to bid, I think. But the most impressive thing, and I've used this as an example of a good practice, and I want to give Florida DOT kudos on their, I consider a best practice in their pavement investigation. They did this on an off-system road, and they saved these folks some really bad heartbreak because they were needing high friction. They definitely need it. This is one of those very severe locations. They were having high crashes, like 15 rollovers in a year. I mean, that's unheard of. I mean, and on a local road particularly. And so you looked at that and you say, well, this definitely warrants it because of the severity of the crashes and the number of crashes they were having. But they had some bad pavement, and the Florida DOT got involved and did the pavement investigation and found out they needed to do some pavement repair before they did an overlay. They're going to do the whole project, the whole section, from my understanding. But obviously, we want to put the high friction where it'll stay, and that's kind of where they are. And I just think that really helped them from making a mistake. Because they, the expertise, Florida DOT has some really good expertise in looking at pavements. A lot of times, I hate to say this, but a lot of you local guys have so many hats to wear, you can't really focus on one specific thing. You're doing, one day safety, another thing, next day you're doing, pavements and on and on and on. So you have so many things to work on. And these guys, at the lab particularly do really heavy focus, and, they're really good. And that's I use the Florida process as a best case scenario for a lot of these states when they look for examples for doing pavement investigation.
Back to the safety aspects of it. Looking at before and after data, we saw in the presentation from Andy some of the before and after data and the numbers. Can you provide a breakdown of the crash types that were reduced?
Unfortunately, I don't have the crash type, and that was the Kentucky data I'm sure that you're looking at. but as far as the installations, the majority were definitely in a rural and high-speed situation. So they're predominant. The reason their install of those high-friction surface treatments was to reduce rural roadway departures. So unfortunately, I don't have a breakdown of all the crash types.
And I can add a little bit to that, and it's not that I have those crash types right off the top of my head, but those locations were developed from a program that Federal Highway piloted in Kentucky. Was one of the early states. What we did is we went in and assessed all their data. This was when I was at the Resource Center team. We assessed all their data and looked at all their crashes and came up with a list and a group of countermeasures that they should be looking at. And they did pursue that list, and they did apply those to those locations. And so a lot of those you're seeing, they're just going down in order. Now, they currently do things differently. They've long since completed that list. So those were some of their worst locations in the country. The first 26 of those were interstate ramps. And they did an evaluation, but then they went on, like Andy said, they did a lot of, their program is heavily focused on rural roads and 2-lane roads particularly, although they have some others, but they're now kind of coming back and doing more interchanges, I will say, because a lot of their recent work was in interchanges. But the ones that are, most of those on there were projects that were about 800 to 1,000 square yards per location. They weren't that big, after the first 26, they weren't really big projects, but they grouped them together. They may be 10 or 15, whatever, in a group, and they ended up, getting better prices for that reason. And so that's how they were bidding it direct to the installers. So they really had really got onto this early and figured out how to go after it. And the one thing I will say is I think their numbers could have even been a little bit better by the mere fact that they didn't treat the braking zone prior to the PC in a lot of their early installations. And we know that does have a big benefit. So you get outside the curve prior to where the people are braking coming into the curve. There's a lot of data that supports that. And kind of like Andy said, you really know this. The best way to figure out how far you need to go, we've got charts and stuff, but it's all based on generalities. The best way to know is to measure the friction. So if you know where it starts to polish, versus a non-braking area, then you know immediately where you need to start your treatment. So there's a lot of benefits in that, being able to control how much you have to put down.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite bullet points in Andy's presentation, was the statement that the continuous treatment test tells you exactly where to install the treatment. All you need to do is look at the data, and the graph will tell you, from this point to that point. I mean, if you're having the crashes, you can identify the locations to install the treatment with the data. I mean, and it goes the other way around. You can also, in a way, predict, if you do the continuous surface treatment without knowing the data, you can, in a way, predict where the crashes will be occurring. So, doing other mediation of those locations as well.
Yeah, Anthony, we probably tend to overtreat, particularly for curves, because we're just very conservative of where we're going to put it down. Texas had made an effort to minimize that. They went through a program of analysis. Now, they were not doing this. It was a good approach they used, but it's still the best and most accurate way to really know what you need and where you need it, is to measure the friction like Andy was showing.
And then with, regarding to since we're talking about both curves and intersections, talking about where to install the treatment, there was a note from the chat as well that consider treating past the stop bars if you're doing intersection treatments, because if someone is having to brake hard, you don't want the friction to go away at that point and have them skid through the intersection. So, there's a fine line between, doing just enough and over treating, and there's use some common sense when we're figuring out the location where we stop and begin the high friction surface treatment.
Yeah, I think it's with in my opinion, the continuous friction is a game changer. When you're doing curves, you can kind of look at the cross slopes and so forth, and you can kind of predict it. But when you're looking at intersections, it's hard to do that because the Q links will vary, you know, and so you really need to be looking at the friction values and the to really get a really good effect, because some of the earlier intersections, and in fact, I know some programs are going on currently that are treating intersections, they're just putting in a set amount of friction value. So what happens is you're stopping the people in the front, the people in the back can't stop. And that's not good. You know, that creates a little bit of a problem. So understanding where your friction starts to polish is going to be where your braking is, and unless you're really monitoring your braking all the time during a day, you know, or maybe you could look. There's ways you could maybe back into that, but it's a little more difficult for sure to be accurate. So site selection, you know, obviously driven by crashes is a good reason to start investigating, as Andy pointed out, and I think that's but you know, they have the tool for really making the best decisions.
What is the cost of the continuous friction versus the old locked wheel method?
Hey, this is Andy. Cost is always a challenge to talk about because anytime that you're conducting field pavement testing, and if you look at it, the total cost, that's really driven by the labor. It really isn't, you know, whenever you amortize the equipment out over how long its life cycle is, that's not a great cost. It's really your labor that drives it. And so if you look at, for friction measurement, to get an idea of the microtexture, to date, all of it requires water and a rubber tire. So the size of your water tank drives how many miles you're going to be able to do that day. And again, how many people you have in the rig, whether you do one or two. So there's a lot of different factors that get into the cost. And you know, Frank has talked about how you package high friction surface treatment contracts. That also drives your cost. In other words, if you're hiring someone to go out and conduct 10,000 miles of friction testing, it's going to be one cost versus if you say you want 200 miles and you want it at these disparate locations. So there's a significant number of variables. And then you look at the actual equipment on the rig. The rig that I showed you that we purchased for our study included many sensors that are not on the conventional locked wheel skid trailers that we use in the U.S. And those are capturing the geometric data, captured the cross slope, horizontal curvature, vertical curvature, GPS. So we had a lot of other sensors on it. So it is quite a change. But if you look at strictly the cost of a locked wheel versus this continuous friction measurement system, you know, this continuous friction measurement system stripped down will be more expensive than the locked wheel just from a piece of equipment comparison. So I don't mean to be evasive, but it really is you know, like almost any cost, it includes many different factors.
One of the things that Andy
that you could provide, like a high range, low range?
You know, the equipment, like I said, if you're getting the continuous measurement, it's driven by how much water you want to carry. So again, I don't know if are you asking me how much a piece of equipment is or what the cost would be to test a mile?
A mile. I think it was just the audience wanted a ballpark figure so they have an idea, you know, kind of like a high range, low range for a per mile cost of testing.
Okay. So I'll give you a very general number for the mileage testing for the continuous, and that is $100 per mile, probably plus or minus $30 per mile, depending upon your unique situation. That would be for the service. That would be for the data. And unfortunately, I don't have a good number for the locked wheel. But like I said, you're really not getting the same data because the locked wheel is a discrete measurement system and you're not getting continuous data. So it really is it's not a one-to-one comparison for the data set.
It sounded, Frank, like you were going to chime in.
Well, I was just going to say that some of those projects are just really starting to bid in the United States. I know there was one last week. Kentucky bid a bunch of, you know, projects. So I don't know. I think as far as what's going to be, you know, how it's going to drive commercially, I know several states that have been pursuing. I know Andy knows that for sure. But you know, oftentimes, and I know from the federal highway perspective, we don't oftentimes get in the commercial aspects. So because that's, you know, a lot of that's not only the cost to do it, but what the market bears, I guess. And so, you know, there's a lot of things that go into that cost factor that's really hard to predict. Distance. Andy pointed out a lot of the physical issues, but you know, contractual issues and on and on. So I would say that. You know, I don't even have a clue myself. I just know that they're starting to bid those around the country, and so that might be something that if somebody wants to get some pricing, they might look at that. Those are more surveillance type contracts, aren't they, Andy? You're familiar with it. Weren't they more surveillance, trying to measure the roadway system itself?
Yeah, the range that I gave you would be more surveillance rather than, you know, come here and do 5 miles here, 10 miles there.
Right.
Be really curious back to the crash data to see, as that surveillance is done over time, you can see the friction in different areas vary, and then correlate that with the crash data. So I mean, you can almost use the surveillance measurements as a prediction. You can create a predictive model to say, you know, this is when things need to be done at certain locations. I think that would be really interesting.
That's right. This is Andy. That's one of the things that this data gives you. So if you think about testing a network, you are driving over pavement of all ages. So right there, you're getting a diverse data set of pavement age, and you're collecting the friction characteristics of that pavement age. And then you have all the attributes related to that roadway, ADT and other factors. So then you can start to get an idea of a certain mix, a certain aggregate, what the life cycle is of the pavement characteristics. So that's what's, I believe, is kind of, you know, beneficial to us from this network level friction testing. We don't have to wait 3 to 5 years like you do for crash data, because your data set for that 1 year is going to include a wide variety of pavement ages.
You know, and the question always comes up, Anthony, this is kind of relates to what Andy was just mentioning. When you look at friction numbers, here's the missing key, and that everybody get a relevant scenario is that what friction value is good enough? That gets into a really loaded question. If you're on a tangent roadway, the values that, you know, are not going to be as demanding because it's not roof, you know, like it's an open roadway. Macrotexture becomes a bigger issue actually in those conditions. And what happens is that the friction values can be lower there, and a lot of states have threshold values. You'll hear this, like I'll ask people, "What's your friction values that you know is your minimum?" They'll throw out a number, and that's really not right. That's only if you're in a tangent. What happens is if you're in a curve, it's all driven by your friction demand versus your friction capability. So you may actually even have decent friction in a curve, but it's not adequate to meet the demand of those geometrics and operating speeds, and that will still be an issue. Because now typically what happens when you have that inequity is it starts to polish your pavement. It does, you know, it accelerates the pavement polishing. So that's generally how you get to a high crash location, because that's, again, that's not, you know, human error. This is physics. We are creating a situation that has occurred over time that, you know, under certain conditions, it's going to be a problem for most people. For most vehicles.
Yeah, this is Guang. Yes, I think Franklin make a good point. You know, this is Guang again. In Florida, you know, we kind of, you know, have the, you know, policy that says, you know, friction number of, you know, the for safety, you know, the funded project, friction number, you know, of, you know, less than 28 for a post speed limit of, you know, less than, you know, 40 miles per hour, or, you know, friction number of 30 as a threshold or less, you know, above, you know, 45 miles per hour. But this, you know, the threshold may not apply, you know, to the ramp, to those, you know, the curves. Because in a lot of times, you know, when we get, you know, the report, we send the people, you know, send the operator, you know, the friction operator to do the test, to collect the data on the ramp, and it turns out that those values is above 30, even above 35. But we still have a lot to crash. So the threshold sometimes defined in the policy may not apply on those curves and the ramps.
Exactly, and a lot of people don't realize that friction demand is something you can calculate based on operating speeds and the geometrics. One of the things I think that creates some of this issue, particularly for suburban areas, is that we, in the Green Book, many years ago, like in the early 90s, eliminated the requirement for super elevation if your speed limits were below 45 and design speed below 45. And so a lot of times what you see is people, and I've seen this in some states where you can see the really severe curve, but the operating speeds are lower. But guess what? Nobody's driving that. So if so the super elevation was set by the the design speed, but then when you have operating speeds that are much greater, then you're basically got a negative cross slope in a in a super, meaning that it's not helping you. Well, super elevation and friction act on a one-to-one basis. So if you don't get it in the super, you've got to get it in the friction. Well, if you're demanding a lot of friction, then it's going to polish out quicker. So what I see a lot of times is that you'll have a curb and gutter section, that's posted at a lower speed, but nobody drives that. So and if the majority of your traffic flow is speeding in that curve, you're going to polish that pavement out faster. It's just going to happen. That's physics. It's predictable. You can do it. And of course, that's going to be driven by not only the speed, but also the types of vehicles and the volume of the vehicles, as to how long that's going to be, but also what kind of aggregates you're using. So that's how long it will last. Those are the factors that determine how long it's going to last. And so if you've got one of those scenarios, yeah, you could go back and increase your super, but then you got to, rebuild that whole section of roadway, because obviously, you put a super in a scenario like that, and you're going to be above the curb easily. So that's where I'm seeing some of the huge benefits for particularly local agencies to look at that where they have high crashes. That may be a really good candidate for a high friction, because that may be the only way to treat that without having to rebuild the roadway.
Yeah, I mean, with the crash data, I was thinking back to the graph that Andy had earlier. Also, I really like the idea of correlating the friction numbers to the mileposts. I mean, just from a crash data standpoint, we do the same thing when we're doing a road safety audit. We look at the various crash types and we map them along the milepost to find hotspots. And it lets us know, hey, at this location here, we have runoff road crashes. At this location here, we have sideswipe crashes. So when we go out in the field, we look for that data. So I mean, it's really interesting to see. You guys basically are doing the same thing with your friction numbers and your mileposts, saying, at this location we have issues, and kind of the combination of both. It would be great to have the friction. I did not participate in the RSAs that you guys had here, where you had those friction numbers, but that would be a really interesting data point to have all the time as the testing becomes more available and the network screening and everything. I'm really excited, to a time when we have that data along all the roadways all the time. One more question based on the crash data. With the Kentucky data, it was mentioned that the locations were identified based on the crash data. And if their locations were identified by the number of crashes, how was regression to the mean taken into account with the before and after analysis?
On that particular study, it wasn't. But we have, there are some studies where they've been recently presented, and I know they're trying to get out a report out of Federal Highway. I just talked to them the other day, and they're trying to accelerate the CMF that's coming out of a study that was done. And they did one early on a few years ago. It was a low-cost pool fund study, did some evaluations of pavements. It's a report that came out. And those CMFs I don't think it was enough. It wasn't as robust as they'd like. They didn't do an empirical based analysis on it, but they just, and it actually was presented at TRB this last year. So like I said, it's been presented, but they're trying to get it published, and Federal Highway is actually trying to get it out, and they're kind of trying to accelerate that that information, which does have addresses regression to the mean. Not that they were not data challenged. One of the things with high friction is that, or with even friction period, is you really need to know before treatment versus an after treatment, and that's always been a challenge because a lot of the early projects that we did evaluate, they were just going out there, we got a crash problem, let's put it down, and they didn't always measure the friction before. Although in some cases we had it. But this one that's what it focused on, was looking at locations where we had known friction values. That was part of the calculation, if you want to call it. And they did multi-states. It was a bigger, much more robust study. They did have some data challenges. Some of the data they could not use because they couldn't, it's problematic, as anybody that's done a safety study knows, particularly with multi-states. It's just a little more complicated than just doing your local jurisdiction. But it literally will be, it's an empirical based CMF in the process. So look for that if you want regression to the mean. Most of the studies that you see from a state perspective are generally naive studies. They're generally 3 year before, 3 year after. Now, you would say, well, that's generally questionable. On a small scale, yeah, but we get these same kind of numbers. Andy showed one state. I've got similar data from just dozens of states, so it's not unique. So when you start seeing that big body of information, you realize that's going to be pretty consistent. It's still very high, very high.
Looking at the time here, we've got less than 5 minutes left in our allotted block. So I'll give you guys each a minute for any closing remarks, but I wanted to say thank you so much to the three of you. This is a wealth of knowledge, one of the longest, kind of most lively Q&As we've had in a while in the Academy. You guys are definitely experts in the topic here. I wanted to let our audience know, again, the webinars are recorded and the presentations are in the chat pod. My contact info, as well as W.T. Bowman's contact info, is on the bottom of the LATSA webpage. So if you need any questions or have, about any advanced training topics, if you want these guys to come back and talk about some other things, how to identify the projects and, the things of that nature, we can always schedule follow-up webinars. But with that, I'll let you guys, say some closing remarks and thank you again.
I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate time as well. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions regarding Florida and the high-friction surface treatment practice procedures, and you can always contact me. I think I have I left the contact information there. Thank you.
Just a comment to say, I think the guys who did gave the presentation today did a wonderful job. I enjoyed it. Thank them for that. And like I said, I'm available for, any questions you have. So I don't know if my information's I think it was on the list there. I'm not sure, but if not, contact Anthony, and you can either look me up, either one, Frank, Julian.
All three of the presenters' information will be on the website, but it was also in the notices of this webinar with the contact information for everyone. So, if anybody has any information, we'll be more than happy to follow up. I guess with that, we will end the recording, and we'll stay on the line for a second if there's any other last-minute things that pop open. But Ben, on your end, if you can please end the recording, and thanks again for everyone. Thank you for your time, and look for notices from us when we schedule the next webinar. Are we still recording, Ben? No? They might actually record the entire time that we're live. No, that was really good, guys. I could actually just talk to you guys for another hour. There was a handful of questions in the chat that we did not get to. I mean, I was bouncing back and forth between the topics as things were being talked about, rather than just going down the list, hitting most of the major topics. But yeah, that was good. I enjoyed that conversation there at the end. I think at the peak we had it was over 100 people. I'm not sure exactly how many. We'll look at the report for the audience when we're done. I know that in the past we've had. Now it'll be a little bit different, but typically we have about 10% of our audience in a conference room where there's multiple people. I imagine that today's webinar, most of the folks that are on there are the actual people that were there, because everyone's social distancing. What was the highest number that you saw, Ben?
I think it was 98 total. That includes us, so about 92, 93, yeah. I think, in terms of regular attendees. Hey, the normal function for stopping the recording doesn't seem to be there. I think I might have to end the meeting in order to stop the recording.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, we can end the meeting, and I guess later.